Feeding the fish. The background to feeding the fish is that we are attempting to rear fish within our aquaponics system that are fast growing and healthy. Furthermore, it is important to recognize that the diet directly affects the health and immunity of the fish, the growth rate, the survival, and fish feed is typically about 30% of the production cost of an aquaponics system. So it is clear that we need to have a good understanding and good management of the fish feed in order to be economically viable. There are two types of feed that we can feed our fish. The first is live food. This is usually cultured on site and is usually small enough to be eaten whole. The importance of live food is for bringing broodstock into spawning condition, which is generally not relevant to aquaponics. Also for the early rearing of fry, which again is not usually done within an aquaponics system. But it is also for improving the health, growth and vitality of the fish, and that certainly is relevant to aquaponics. So what are the options? Live food includes duckweed. The Lemna genus is well documented on the internet type literature, and within southern Africa we have an indigenous species in the genus Spirodella. This is an excellent fish feed. Earthworms are also fantastic fish feed, and within an aquaponics environment there will be a lot of plant material that is removed when the plants reach the end of their life cycle or during regular pruning of the plants. This material can all be turned into earthworm feed, and the earthworms in turn added back to the system. Daphnia is a freshwater crustacean that needs to be cultured in a dedicated environment, but they can be farmed in very, very large quantities and also form a very suitable form of food for the fish, most especially for the smaller sizes. Maggots are also an excellent source of particularly fat and protein for the fish. Whilst the diet can't be based on maggots because of the fattiness, they can certainly form a large portion of the diet. The other option in terms of feeding is artificial feed. Here, the advantage is that we get a prepared formula for each species. So in theory anyway, it should be exactly the right food for optimal growth of that species. Artificial food is provided as pellets most commonly, but also powder and flake for the smaller sized fish. It should be highly digestible, and it should have a high level of palatability so that the fish recognize it as feed and eat it. The advantages of artificial food include the fact that it can be stored. It has bulk availability, so it's available at all times, regardless of whether it is Christmas time, New Year, Easter, or whether there is a strike happening. Also, nutritional value should be optimal for the species one is farming. And the ease of use is also enormous, such that artificial feeders can be used with artificial feed. More on this later. In terms of the quality of an artificial feed, the pellet should ideally be moist, because this indicates that it has got an adequate fat level, and this is most especially important when dealing with carnivorous species such as trout. The pellet shouldn't crumble. If it crumbles, it'll form dust, and that represents wastage and it compromises water quality. The fish feed should also smell fishy. This isn't essential, but it is indicative of palatability. In terms of the feed components, there are three primary components to a diet. The first of these is protein. During digestion, protein is broken down into amino acids. Amino acids in turn are assembled as building blocks for protein growth. However, the breakdown of amino acids also releases energy, but we don't want the fish using this as the energy source, because the amino acids or proteins within the diet are usually the most or one of the most expensive components in the diet. The amino acid ratio is extremely important. For a tilapia to grow, it needs to lay down amino acids in a certain very strict ratio. As soon as the first of those amino acids is no longer available for the next protein molecule to be laid down, growth stops dead. There can be no further growth until the amino acid ratio is again corrected by additional feed. So what this means is if you've got a feed that has got a high protein level but the wrong amino acid profile, then not all of that protein is going to be available for growth. Also recognize that the fry require more protein in their diet than do adults of the same species. As a consequence, you'll find that your smaller feed sizes tend to have a higher protein concentration and are more expensive than your larger feed sizes. The next feed component is carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are comprised of starch, and the breakdown of starch provides energy for the fish. It's a relatively inexpensive component, and certainly the energetic value is relevant. But the primary functions of the carbohydrate within the diet is as a binder to stick all the ingredients together during the extrusion process, and then hold them together to give you water stability, and also to enable the diet to float. The cooking of carbohydrates during the extrusion process causes them to expand, and this results in a low density floating pellet, which makes the management of feeding much easier. Lipids are broken down into fatty acids, and fatty acids are the building blocks for cells. Fatty acids also play a role in terms of palatability, but the primary function of the fatty acids within the feed is generally as the energy source. Then there are a whole lot of minor components which are essential in a diet, but in far lower quantities. It is important to feed the correct quantity of food to the fish. If we feed too little, the food will be used firstly for body maintenance, and only what is left, if anything is left, can result in growth. Consequently, growth is compromised at the expense of body maintenance if there is insufficient feed supplied. Also, by feeding too little, we enhance aggression and cannibalism as well as differential growth rates within our fish population. If we feed too much, this is a simple waste. Fish will only eat as much as they require. Then they stop eating. The rest of the food will float around within the system and eventually break down and be sucked up by the pumps and compromise the water quality and block the mechanical filters or block the beds. Do not overfeed the fish. We always only feed as much as the fish will eat. So how do we make sure that we are giving the fish enough food? Well, the first option is to feed to satiation. This means that we throw a handful of feed into the tank, the fish eat it. If they've finished all the food, we give them another handful until they've eaten it, then another handful. And when you notice that they start slowing down, that they don't respond as aggressively to the feed anymore, then you stop feeding. Don't try and get the last feed granule into the fish, as this can result in overfeeding, and sometimes they'll even regurgitate some of the feed after feeding. So we stop feeding once you notice that the feeding response is tapering off. Satiation feeding is, by the very nature of the thing, done by hand, and this has distinct advantages. I like to think of this as the Gloria effect. Whilst your staff are walking around feeding the fish on a fish farm or in an aquaponics environment, they are not thinking about what they're doing. Rather, they're thinking about the glorious weekend they've just had with Gloria. But while they're thinking about Gloria and their mind is disengaged, their consciousness is engaged, and they will notice that the water is flowing into the tanks correctly. They will notice the smells, they will notice the sounds, they will notice the bubbles, they'll notice the water quality, and very, very importantly, they will notice the response of the fish to them at the time of feeding. All of these things are done subconsciously while the mind is engaged elsewhere. But the benefit is that as soon as one of those parameters is not correct, the staff will quickly observe it, they will notice it, and they will then go and investigate and find out what the problem is. What is causing that abnormal behavior, incorrect sound, wrong water quality, whatever the situation might be. The alternative option is to feed according to automatic feeders, and this completely removes the advantage of hand feeding where you see every single tank in the system several times per day. An alternative option to feeding to satiation is to feed according to body mass. What happens here is that we use a table, and I do not agree, I do not support this method, but I mention it because many very highly respected people in the aquaculture and aquaponics industry do observe this method of feeding. What happens here is we have feed tables which are worked out according to the species, according to the mass of the fish, and according to the number of fish in the tanks, and it assumes optimal conditions. That is very, very important to bear in mind. So let's say, for instance, that we have 1,000 tilapia of 20 grams average mass in the tank. That means that if we go down to below the 1,000 and to the row that has 20 grams in it, we see we need 1.4 kilograms of feed fed to that tank per day. The way in which you would then do this is to weigh out that 1.4 kilograms and go and place it into the automatic feeder to be distributed over a period of hours to that tank of fish. You'll find that fry will eat about 15% of their body mass per day, but by the time the fish attain market size, they are normally eating in the region of 1 to 2% of their body mass per day. It is very important to understand that we need to adapt these tables according to water temperature, dissolved oxygen, fish density, and fish size. Now, density and size are built into the table. Oxygen and water temperature are not. Therefore, if either the oxygen or the water temperature levels are outside of the desirable level for that species, then we need to reduce feeding. If the temperature is too high, we reduce feeding. If the temperature is too low, we reduce feeding. Otherwise, we are going to be adding more fish feed to the system than what the fish can consume, and that will result in problems. How often do we feed the fish? Well, the simple answer is as often as possible. Large fish should be fed at least 3 times per day, and fry should be fed at least 5 times per day. The particle size must obviously suit the size of the fish's mouth. If the particle is too large, the fish cannot ingest it. So what they do is they worry the particle as it floats on the surface by nibbling at it until it softens and they're able to eat it. Many of the nutritional components are lost, and finally when they do manage to swallow a piece, it might be too large for efficient digestion, and some of the feed can pass undigested through the fish's gut. If the feed size is too small, the fish tend to waste energy feeding and often do not feed to satiation. So where do we feed the fish? Well, feed them on the surface using a floating pellet. That is the ideal situation. Monitor the feeding response, and in association with that, monitor uneaten food. There should never be uneaten food. Always only feed enough for the fish to eat. Spread the food around so that all fish have equal access to the feed. This promotes even growth. Whenever we are changing diets, most especially when we're changing diet type with fry from live food onto the first artificial food, but to a lesser degree also when you're changing the diet size, it's important to overlap the old and new foods. The way we do it is we feed the new food first, and then 5 minutes or so later we feed the old food, and we do this for a period of 3 days. On day 1 the proportion of new food is very low, on day 2 it's 50-50, and on day 3 the proportion of new food is greater than the old food. In this way all the fish within the population have a chance to get used to eating the new food prior to the old food being removed from their diet. The mode of delivery, we also spoke about automation as being the other option for feeding the fish. There are distinct advantages to feeding fish by means of automation, including the fact that the fish can be fed more often, especially the fry, without increasing the laboring requirement. It also spreads the feedings out, so you can have very frequent smaller feedings, which means that the oxygen demand and the ammonia production don't spike as much as they do if you have fewer larger feedings per day. There are various options. The first is time activated. If all your conditions remain constant, time activated is ideal because we know how much feed the fish will eat under optimal conditions in a given period of time, and that amount of food can therefore be provided. However, if there is a water quality problem and the fish are not eating properly, it will add to this water quality problem. The other option is to use a fish activated system. Typically here there would be a hopper with a pendulum hanging into the water. When the fish are hungry, they would bump the pendulum, releasing a few grains of feed into the water. This is far better than a time activated option, provided that the fish do recognize this as a way of feeding themselves, and they generally learn pretty quickly. However, with certain species of fish such as carp, they become playful. They knock the pendulum to watch the pellets falling without having any intention of eating the food. The other option for feeding our fish is manual. We've mentioned this already under the advantages earlier, but it is labor intensive. However, the major advantage here is that you see this fish and the system several times every single day, which gives you an opportunity to rapidly observe wastage and other problems within the system and fix these before they become a big issue. Feed storage is very important. We need to store the feed in a cool, dry, pest-free environment. And one can add clean to that as well. Fish feed generally has a shelf life of 3 to 6 months. And if it ever gets wet, it needs to be discarded. And by discarded, I don't mean fed to the fish. I mean used as compost in the garden. This is an example of an aquaculture environment rather than aquaponics. But here you can see some pendulum feeders being used for feeding these trout. This is a belt feeder. In the morning the belt is retracted, it is spring loaded, much like an analog watch, and as the spring slowly rewinds the belt over the axle, the feed that has been spread across the belt then falls off into the fish tank. The rule of thumb for any aquaculture venture is that the market price you achieve for the fish should be roughly 3 times the feed price. This is true within aquaponics as well. Thank you.